I've wanted to post this story for years, and now I finally have a way to share it. This is going to be a long read, but I'll tell you about the scariest experience of my life. I was 15 years old, living in a medium-sized city in North Florida. About 60,000 people or so, but some areas were really spread out and rural. Don't think of it like New York City or anything. More like a lot of houses spread out over a huge area, with a condensed shopping center here and there. I was a bit of a punk that my parents had a hard time controlling, so that meant I basically snuck out constantly and was always riding my bike around the city all hours of the night with my friends, fighting and constantly causing trouble. For reference, I was probably about 5'10" and 150 pounds around this time. My next-door neighbors were my best friends. Let's call them Nick and Tim. Nick was the younger, and probably 5'5" and 140 pounds. Tim was 5'8" and easily 210. They were brothers and only a year or so apart. On that night, Tim had texted me around 1 a.m., asking me to go ride with him and his brother to his girlfriend's house so he could try and get lucky. I remember being very hesitant because of how long the ride was. I looked it up and it was about 10 miles from my house to her street. But Tim begged and begged me to go until eventually I agreed. Our city had a curfew, meaning any police in the area that saw you and assumed you were a minor would stop you and possibly issue a ticket and bring you home. That meant we had to be careful about being seen by any cars going by. Well, the bike ride to her house went by without any issues. We took our time, joked around, smoked a little pot, and genuinely enjoyed the ride together. We ran out of what little pot we had on the way, and finally got to his girlfriend's house after what felt like an hour. Tim snuck around the back to go in, and Nick and I just sat near the electrical box and talked. Maybe 30 or so minutes went by, and Tim triumphantly snuck out of the house, bragging about his time in there. He said we should head back home now. Annoyed at how long we'd been waiting there, and nearly sober now, we both agreed. The first mile of the ride back went fairly smoothly, but soon after, things changed. We had just passed a decent-sized shopping area, which was obviously closed, and a church. We rode by slowly, in zero rush at all. After we passed, it led to a long stretch of road, with woods and canals on each side. 2 lanes on each side separated by palm trees and landscaping in the middle. We were riding on the right-hand sidewalk, when off in the distance we saw a very tall older man wearing a yellow raincoat and a large backpack. He was just pacing back and forth on the sidewalk under a street light on the corner of the parkway and side street. We all went silent as we got closer. I don't think he could see and hear us from that far away, as there were no lights over us and there were sprinklers going off in the median as well. I remember hearing him dragging his feet across the ground, clearly mumbling something to himself. He was dragging his feet almost like he was trying to brush away the concrete to find something underneath it. The mumbling was becoming more incoherent and frantic as we approached closer. Honestly, it made my stomach knot up and my heart sink in my chest. I couldn't understand anything he was saying, mind you. The only way to get home, though, was to go right by him. "Hey, why don't we cross the street and go another way?" Tim and I agreed. I remember this so distinctly. As we crossed the landscaped medium, a jet of sprinkler water hit me directly in the face and got in my mouth and eyes. It smelled horribly. We could now hear the mumbling and scraping of his feet much clearer. I could make out more details about him as well. He was smoking a cigarette. Probably 6'5" or so. He had this huge backpack on and was extremely skinny. Really long gray hair, wearing combat boots and ripped jeans. He had a full white beard, almost kind of like Gandalf or something. He didn't seem to notice us until we were directly across from him. We all had our eyes locked in his direction when he suddenly stopped moving altogether. He stopped talking, stopped scraping his feet. All of a sudden, he just looked up from the ground and let out this god-awful screech. It was like he was screaming 100 words at once. None of us knew what he was trying to say, obviously. After the initial scream, though, I could make out one thing. "What the fuck are you doing?" It startled us. We were now only 25 yards away from him. When he turned to look at us, it was obvious he was addressing us. "What the fuck are you looking at?" I was a foolish teenager. I piped up trying to say something smart when Tim grabbed my mouth and said, "Don't say a fucking word." I didn't. I kept quiet. In hindsight, I'm glad I kept quiet. The man kept screaming in our direction as we rode past him. The further we rode, the fainter the screaming got, and then it stopped altogether. We crossed the street again to the other side and made it about a mile down the road, all of us now on edge. We kept glancing over our shoulders constantly to make sure the man was not following us or something. We talked briefly about it, how strange that was, but we were glad it was over with. Or so we thought. Nick and Tim were riding in front of me, when suddenly I thought I could hear something from behind me. I turned around, and there he was only an arm's length away, rushing directly for me. The yellow raincoat was pulled up over his head and buttoned to hide his face. The man was standing up on his mountain bike, pedaling insanely fast. We locked eyes, and he just started screaming, and I mean fully screaming. Not even words, not any language, just a constant howling scream, as loud as he could. I get the chills even writing this down now. If someone ever illustrated an image of that moment and I saw it, I'd have a panic attack immediately. I screamed to everyone else, "He's right behind us!" We started pedaling as hard as we could. He was right behind us the whole time though, still screaming. Every so often he would catch right up to us, screaming and trying to knock us off our bikes with an attack. I don't know how long we rode with him chasing us, but it felt like an eternity. I think age played a huge factor in the end though, because he eventually got tired and we started to ease ahead a bit. Exhausted, we pulled into a random neighborhood and started cutting through yards trying to lose him. We jumped off our bikes and all just decided that if he was still chasing us, we were going to make a stand together and fight him. It was like a hive mind decision. We were all too tired to keep going, so this was our only option. We waited and waited for him to come to us, but he didn't come. I don't even remember hearing him anymore. I guess somehow we'd lost him. I called my house phone, waking both my parents up in the process, and told my dad about the situation. He told me to get home and figure it out myself. I asked to talk to my mother, and she yelled at me on the phone and refused to pick us up as I stood there in the middle of the street, hoping this crackhead didn't come back and kill us all. I got home with Nick and Tim in tow, who asked if they could crash in my room. Of course, I said yes. I think we all have some weird feelings about that night, and we never really spoke of it again. I don't know what he wanted, and clearly he was on drugs, but it makes me wonder, would he have robbed us or done something worse if he'd got up to us? I was driving home from house sitting in another city. It usually takes me about 6 hours to do this drive on my motorcycle because I have to pull over regularly to massage feeling back into my butt and stretch my legs a bit. I left around 11:30 a.m. and happened to miss a weather alert with thunderstorm warnings along my route. This road takes me through mountain passes with a lot of hairpin turns. The normal speed is 80 kilometers per hour, and a couple of these turns have posted speeds going as low as 30. It started hailing and pouring rain, full-on thunderstorm weather. I was doing my best to keep the speed limit while also being safe. There was nowhere to pull over and just wait it out, not many passing lanes in the mountains. On the last hairpin turn, I slowed down to take it at the posted speed when this huge truck, who'd been behind me for about 15 minutes, pulled into the oncoming lane, illegally mind you. They sped up next to me, laying on the horn thick. It was a blind corner. He saw oncoming traffic coming right at him. Instead of doing the smart thing and slowing down to get back behind me, he decided to gun it. If I hadn't downshifted immediately when I realized he was going to do this, he would have nailed me with the 30-foot trailer he was dragging behind him, sending me flying off the cliff next to us. The next town was about 20 minutes away. I pulled into a gas station to dry out a little and calm down after what just happened. I watched the man calmly drive away like nothing ever occurred. About 2 hours later, I pulled into a fruit stand to grab a snack and take a well-deserved break. This was now 3 towns further down the highway, mind you. Lo and behold, somehow that exact same guy was there. He saw my motorcycle and pulled in to have a go at me. He screamed at me that he was about to teach me a lesson for slowing down on the highway to the posted speed limits for safe turns, mind you. When I asked him what he would have done if he'd killed me, he told me it would have been my own fault, and he would have laughed as I went flying over the cliff. We got into a scuffle, but that was about it. I really hope I don't ever run into that guy on the road again. What a crazy asshole. About 3 years ago, I, 21 and female, was a waitress during the height of COVID. It was my first ever job, and I remember being excited to start as soon as possible. After all my training was finished and I got my certifications, I was put on the closing shift. We closed at 10 p.m. every night at the same time. Typically, it was just the cook, 20s and male, and I. Rarely would there be another waitress with me, and I sorta liked it that way. I always worked better alone and didn't really get along with most of the other waitresses anyway, so it was quite nice and peaceful. I can remember it was near the end of my time there that this experience happened, and I'm really happy I had the circumstances I did at the time. I never was one to really trust my gut very much. I have mild anxiety, and I couldn't tell if what I felt half the time was valid or not. I mention this because when this all went down, it felt real, and I had an absolute feeling. I had started my shift that evening around 3 p.m. or so. I said goodbye to the last waitress sometime later, and I was on my own with my cook now. Everything was pretty slow and normal until I got a call about one of the specialty items on the limited time menu we had. The food couldn't be ordered as takeout, and the lady over the phone really didn't take that well. After a bit of debating, she decided to finally sit in and eat instead. I'd say around 10 minutes later is when I spotted an older-looking car pull up and 3 people climb out. 2 men and a woman who looked to be in their 30s to 40s. I could tell it was the very same lady I'd spoken to over the phone, judging by her attitude coming in. I further confirmed it by asking, since I already had a pretty good idea of what she wanted to eat. What I thought was an act of mild embarrassment and pettiness turned out to be something much more sinister later on. Her attitude toward me changed immediately once she saw me. She was much nicer and more cooperative. This didn't ring any bells at first, because it was something that most people who wanted to look good in front of others would do. I sat them down at a booth and took all their orders. I noticed they had this red binder and a black pen as well. I then went to tend to the other customers, as there were a couple of other tables I was waiting on too. Once I brought their food out to them, they asked me if I knew any realtors. I found this to be pretty normal, as this was a tourist vacation state. It wasn't uncommon for outsiders to be looking for getaway homes here. I would say this was a pretty reasonable assumption, as they didn't look like the unsavory type of people, if you get what I mean. Nonetheless, I gave them the phone number to a realtor I knew closely, and well, since I often went to church with her, there wasn't really any other notable interactions with them. There was some occasional small talk if I wasn't doing anything or if I was refilling their drinks or something. It was around 4:30 now, and they were the last of my tables to leave the restaurant. If any of you work in the food industry, you know that as a server, you don't really get breaks. Just lunch most of the time. Sometimes not even that if it's super busy all day. My cook and I took this as an opportunity for a well-deserved break then. We walked out behind them and had a small chat. I should mention by now that the front of the restaurant had a disabled ramp coming up the doors. It was long because the building was on a raised foundation. I didn't really notice it at the time, but one of the men took my cook to the other side of the ramp down near the end and started chatting with him over a cigarette. I was behind the railing at the top of the platform where the ramp plateaued. The other man and the woman were on the other side of the railing, about 5 feet below in front of me. We were talking about some random thing, and they started to ask some personal questions, such as if I lived in the area, if I smoked weed, how old I was. I hadn't quite learned yet that telling strangers such things wasn't a good idea. However, for some reason to me, this was starting to raise some red flags. I gave some very vague answers to all her questions best I could. They still persisted in trying to have some sort of communication with me outside my work though, no matter if I said no or not. I suppose they finally realized I wasn't going to give any more personal information up. So, the woman finally got to her point. She told me that she had some business to offer me, a cleaning service. I don't like cleaning anyway, so regardless, I would have said no. However, what she said next really solidified my answer. She proceeded to tell me she owned this maid service called the Pretty Kitties service. She said she needed pretty young girls like me, and she had 10 right now. She wanted to expand the business. She mentioned they got paid $30K but didn't specify the length of time and how it would be a really great opportunity for me to help her with her business. I instantly knew something was off here and that I was in danger. However, I didn't understand just how much danger I was in. I politely declined her offer and told her I liked my job as it was. I was very satisfied where I was working right now. She tried to further convince me by telling me how easy the work was and reiterating how much I'd make under her supervision. She mentioned something about the car for her business and told me to follow her to her car. She said she'd show me a picture of something. I knew for certain I was not going anywhere near her or near that car though. I declined yet again and said I was fine right where I was. I said she could show me on her phone whatever she needed to, but suddenly she was now hesitant. She proceeded to end the conversation immediately and bolted off with the two men. A little weirded out, I walked back into the restaurant with my cook and told him about what I'd just experienced. He joked about how I'd have good money if I went along with them. Because I didn't take the situation as seriously as I should have, I laughed with him. At the end of the night, when the cook's grandmother came to pick us up, I mentioned that weird interaction. A panicked look came over her and she sat silent, staring at me. I got confused and asked her if everything was okay. That's when I learned the signs of human trafficking. She broke it to me that I was almost trafficked, and I was incredibly lucky I didn't get kidnapped. My stomach dropped, and I panicked at the realization of just what was going on. Now, remember that red binder and black pen earlier? I went to work the next day and a customer walked in. Now, normally in my part of town, not many people like to sit and relax for a while. They're mostly there to just eat and leave, as it wasn't exactly a cafe. I went to get into my apron and sit this gentleman down. He was well dressed and alone. I sat him at a single booth and took his order of a single coffee. He had a red binder and black pen with him. I didn't even notice until my cook from the night before reminded me of it. I was shocked to see the exact same thing there. It unsettled me even more when he proceeded to just sit there for 3 hours, watching me the whole time. I kept asking him if he needed anything, but he didn't respond to me. I just sort of shrugged and went on with my business. Now, this might surprise some of you, but us servers, believe it or not, do listen in on some conversations. I'm lucky I did with this particular one. I remember him speaking over the phone about finances and how he needed to find another house. He spoke about moving money and how he was going to pay his girls that night. I ran to the back of the kitchen and told the cook. Thankfully, he came out with me to help deliver some plates in order to throw the guy off. He ended up leaving not long after my cook appeared, and I haven't seen or heard anything since. This happened a few years ago around mid-November. My mother and I love being outside and going for walks. This night in particular was freezing, but we decided we wanted to go out for a quick walk anyway. As we walked back home, we went down this one street that we used all the time. It was a neighborhood street that led back to the main street, then into our neighborhood. We got about halfway down the street when I heard a dog bark over the music on my phone. I turned it off and started looking around. I love dogs, and I wasn't aware there was a dog on this area of the street. For some context, I knew just about everyone in the neighborhood, and I knew which houses had dogs as well. Most of the people on the block had cats. This came from a house that didn't have a dog, let alone a big one. I happened to spin around to look and saw a dark mass just feet away from me. If they'd stepped 2 more feet, they would have been able to easily grab me. I felt a sudden surge of danger and started speed walking back to my mom, who at that point I didn't realize had stopped altogether. I turned off my phone and whispered to her that somebody was following us. She turned around and grabbed my arm. She told me there wasn't just one person, there were 2 men following us from different directions. We started to move through a zigzag pattern, and sure enough, they followed our every step. Once they caught on that we knew they were following us, one of the dudes called out and tried to start chit-chat with us. "Awfully late for you two to be out walking alone, huh?" I swear, his voice sounded like the definition of a siren's voice or something, the kind that lures sailors to their doom. He continued calling out to us. My mom kept walking and replying with quick replies. From the sound of his voice, though, I could tell we were in danger. I went to call 911. Instead, my mom told me to call my dad, as he would be able to get there quicker because we were almost home already. We got onto the busy street and looked behind us to see them catching up on us easily. We decided to risk it and ran into the middle of the street as cars passed on either side of us. We ran across again and met my dad on the other side. When we looked across the street, though, both men were already gone. We hopped into the car and searched the streets, but these guys had disappeared into what seemed like thin air. I asked my mom what would have happened if I hadn't heard that dog barking, and she asked me, "What dog?" I asked her how she hadn't heard that massive dog bark, especially with how good her hearing usually is, but she said there was nothing at all. I still have no clue what it was I heard in that moment, but I do know that sudden coincidence just happened to save my life.